Shepherd's was on the corner. That was Roy Shepherd. Sorry. You know, and the store is gone, but they've built an empire on cable television, and they do very well. And Grandma Shepherd just passed away, but Roy Sr. still lives here in town, and of course Roy Jr. is in Jamestown. And of course, Foss Drug. The only place I think I've ever had a frozen Coke. And we used to go in there sometimes at noon, and you'd see boys from our class reading magazines that, for whatever reason, you had to turn on their side. And Tom Nix worked there as kind of the manager, and he kind of tried to ride herd on that. And he was forever taking those away and shoving people out the door, and then he got elected sheriff. And I'm thinking that's probably the qualification you have for that. Bong's Bootery. How many of you live in a town where there's still an independent shoe store? Huh? Honest to goodness, there can't be anybody left on the planet who's got more experience selling shoes than Damon Bong. Is Damon here? No? Mary Lee mentioned, I don't mean to turn this whole thing into a commercial for Bong's Bootery, but if you want to get transported back in time and get a great pair of shoes at a good price and really good service, before you leave town, go spend some money at Bong's Bootery. For goodness sakes, it'll just be fun for you. And of course, there's the Loop. You know, we all used to drive the A&W, the Dairy-O, the Dairy Queen. And I wish Cole Seaborn was here tonight. I talked to Jane Larson last night, and she lived in the big red house where the wall is on Central Avenue. Nobody here's ever sat on the wall, have they? You remember when we were freshmen and Cole's dad had bought a brand new '69 Cadillac Eldorado, the first car I ever saw with a power sunroof. And Cole's out driving around, he's 14 years old. They got rid of that thing for a reason. And there's like 18 people sitting on the wall, and Cole's making the loop, and as he drives by, he honks the horn and waves and sideswipes 4 parked cars. And I got to thinking about KOBC and Dale Olson, Voice of the Valley. And of course, you know, there was always a kid DJ. We had Jack Ingstead, whose folks owned the station, and he called himself Master Jack, and they played that song. Robbie Olson, Rick Dunn, who was in our class of '72, Dale Harris, the Wild Hair. Anybody remember? When he grew up and he was still working there, then he changed his name to Jason Hunt. But he's still here. And the little car that they had, remember the little tiny BMW Isetta? It was a little one-door car. The front swung open and the steering wheel came out, and then 2 people could sit in it and close the door. And Ron Elstrom bought it, and we took it to a basketball game at the auditorium one night. When we came out, somebody had turned it over, and it was laying on its side in the snow. And the 2 of us were able to right it and drive away in it without harm. In those days, you could buy gas at Earl's Sporting Goods, Gene Lohendorf's Service, where our friend Jerry Reinisch worked, Mark Hill's 66, Sunset 66, which was Barry Berenson, Dave's brother, Peterson Oil Company, which was Gene and Bob and Craig Peterson's dad, Farmers Union, Valley Apco, Mike Downs, our dearly departed, Herb's Texaco, Ed's Texaco, Peg Garage, which then became McCurley Chevrolet. The John Deere store sold gas. There was a West Side discount station across from Robbie's that I don't remember the name of. Interstate Sinclair. Van Erden's had a repair shop that sold gas. There's a gas station. Van Erden's, I heard that. Gordon's DX station and J&L Standard. There was, remember Sourdough Sam's restaurant? Honey Bitts was the lady, Paul Bitts' mom, who waited on us at night late when we wanted oyster stew at Max Cafe. The American Cafe, I think that was Kramer's. Dolly's Cafe was Sandy Dahl's mom and dad, Jerry Dahl's. Crawford's Cafe, the Pizza Corner. To this day, every time I walk in the Pizza Corner, I expect to hear that song, Brandy, You're a Fine Girl. I hate that song, but it was always on the jukebox when Seaborn was working there. And the Highliner Cafe, which is where my mom was working the night I ran her car into the back of that car in front of the gamble store with Debbie Meyer. Bad deal. Remember Howard, who sat in his wheelchair out front of the Cheyenne Care Center smoking his pipe? Charlie Brown? Huh? They had the good sense to name the baseball field after it. Here's when I was walking through this thing with Jay Darby and talking to him by email about all this stuff, the most powerful memory I got hit me all at once when I hate when people do this, but close your eyes for a second. I just want to see if this works for you guys. I'm not going to have you touch anybody. It's just... Close your eyes and I'm going to just say 3 words and see if you get the smell. Ed's popcorn stand. There'll never be another like it, and I have really good news. Ed's popcorn stand is not gone. It's not downtown anymore, but you all remember Louis Smith, who was 100 when we were in high school. Louis passed away about a year ago. I think he was actually in his mid-90s. He had a wrecking yard out north of town, over a hill where you couldn't see it. And they were going to auction it off. So I went out there one Sunday afternoon. I'm walking around. I'm kind of a junk collector anyway, and I thought maybe I'd just buy a whole collection. And as it turns out, there are dozens of old mobile homes, dozens of old buildings, dozens of old vehicles, and Ed's popcorn stand. No joke. And I think, I heard this from a fairly reliable source, that Mickey Caveen and Ricky Anderson really wanted to go get it and bring it into town and fix it up for this reunion, and it was a little too far gone. And I'm thinking, if you guys like put a whole bunch of money in a pot, we'll get Mickey and Rick on that project for the next one. When I got to thinking about smells, another one that came back to me was Olson's studio. Remember going into Olson's photo studio and you had those smells of that photographic chemicals? And you know, you can't go to Ed's anymore and you can't go to Olson's studio anymore, but you can go back to Bong's Bootery and that still smells like leather. It's great. How about this? Osmosis is the diffusion of water through a... It was the only thing I learned in high school that I remember. Could Mr. Strandberg possibly point with any finger other than his big bony middle finger? Wasn't possible. I just loved Mrs. Leeson. Carl Tate, Barb's dad, you know, a World War II hero, cleaning up after us, and coming in every spring and talking to Mr. Goff's class about falling off the windmill for the life of me. You pays your nickel and you. The 2 most popular town names in America are Goslow and bingo, Mr. White, Goslow and Resume Speed. All right. I could go on, and I already have. John Reed, you know, what a guy. Taught me for all 4 years of high school and then had the courtesy to show up at the college when I got there. And I got him for 4 more years. That was a hoot. And we did all of that stuff before we were 18 years old. You know, I think about all of this stuff. You know, we were out learning to live. At the same time, we were learning to walk and talk and eat and cook and read and write and go to school and be somewhat social animals. And I don't think I've ever crammed as much stuff into an 18-year period as I did those first 18 years, and that's probably something of a shame. I think that it's important that we learn some social skills there, and it's part of what brings us back, you know, after 30 years, or 35 or 40 or how long you've been out of high school. Here we are, you know, and it's not just morbid curiosity that brings us back. I think there's this innate need to reconnect. You know, God's hardwired us to believe that where we grew up is the best place on earth. And you can go other places and see better scenery, but there's just nothing like coming home. And I think for me, when I came back to Valley City, it's the one place where I am most comfortable. I just like being here. And part of that, I think, is just, you know, it's where I grew up. It's what I know, and I like the people here, and I fit in. I'm going to close with a really short story. About 10 years ago, or 11 years ago, the company I worked for sent me to Albuquerque, New Mexico for the winter. Happened to be that winter of 96, 97 when you couldn't move up here anyway. And the only person I knew in New Mexico that I could remember that I knew was Terry Horgan. And Terry was the dad. Terry and Ruthie were mom and dad to Terry, Joe, and Tommy, who would have been here tonight if they'd have known what was good for them. Terry used to own a car lot called Viking Sales, and I don't know, Ruthie was a stay-at-home mom until later in life, and then she got a teaching degree. And when she got her teaching degree, she was offered a job in Roswell, New Mexico. All right, so I'm in Albuquerque, and I'm traveling that whole Southwest, opening up a territory. And I get to Roswell one day, and I decide I'm going to stop and see Terry Horgan. I'm overnight there anyway, so I go over and I look him up in the phone book, go bang on the door, and he lives in a mobile home in a retirement park. I'm thinking, okay. And I knock on the door, and Ruthie comes to the door, and I introduce myself, and she's like, my goodness. And I said, is Terry home? No, Terry's at our cabin up in the mountains. But he'd love to see you. I'll show you how to get there. She draws me a map and says, we don't have a phone up there. Just go see him, he'll love it. So the next day, I go see Terry. Well, Terry talks me into staying for the weekend. It's Friday afternoon. And so I spend the weekend there. And this is not a fancy place. This is a mobile home on the side of the steepest mountain you could put a mobile home on. But it's comfortable, and we get up the next morning, we're sitting at the deck drinking coffee. And we're on our second air pot full of coffee, and the neighbormen are all walking over and sitting and drinking coffee. And finally they all leave, and we're still sitting there drinking coffee. And finally I looked at Terry and I said, Terry, you got to tell me something. I said, what happened to you? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, when you lived in Valley City, you couldn't sit still for 3 minutes. You were always running hard, you worked hard, you played hard, you were funny, but you know, you were a little overbearing. And I said, we've been sitting here for 2.5 hours drinking coffee and you're not moving. And he said, I'll tell you what happened. He said, about 6 years ago I had a bout with cancer. He said, I was laying in a hospital, not knowing whether I was going to live or die. And he said, oh, look at this. I get a little choked up. He said, I didn't know if I was going to live or die. And he said, at that point, he said, it occurred to me that on the day you die, none of your stuff is worth a crap to you. And I don't know, that made such a huge impression on me, and I really try to keep that in mind no matter what I'm doing. That and the fact that I'm over 50 now, I weigh everything against, you know, how important is it really? So my closing thought would be, don't get too caught up in the stuff. You came here to have a little fun, see your friends, go home, hug your kids. And tomorrow morning at 10:30, John Gurley's going to preach. There's going to be a memorial service for the people we've lost from our classes. I think it's fun to get together. We need to get together and laugh together, but it's probably as important, I hate this part, that we get together and remember, and it's okay to cry together. So you can make it tomorrow morning, 10:30, VFW Park. Thank you. I appreciate the time.